There we go. So welcome everybody to Sand Talk Session 2, the Mutations Animist Arts book club that we've been hosting for August. And we're also going to be hosting, or Animist Arts is going to be hosting through Dare's Patreon for September. And I do think the dates were just posted. I had them up here. What is it, the 9th of September? Right. Dare, did you want to jump in and just quickly let
Yeah,
folks
of
know?
course. They're Thursdays, and they're in more in the evening, so other people from other time zones could maybe show up. And they're at 4 p.m. Pacific time on Thursday, the 9th and the 23rd of September. And it'll be pretty much the same kind of format. We're going to release everything recorded. Um, but please show up and chat. Larissa will also be able to join some of those. So there will be like three co-facilitators if Jeremy decides that they can show up too. Which there's no pressure, obviously, because I like the, I like the idea of like letting it be a group thing, but it's not mandatory.
Sure, sure.
Yeah,
No, that's great. Thank you. So those are all posted online and
yeah.
on Dare's Patreon and also on Facebook. So check
Yeah,
those
if you go
out.
to the pinned post on my Facebook timeline, you'll see a bunch of new announcements because a bunch of new stuff has just sort of coalesced. So I made a big post that has it all organized.
Yes, yes. And looking forward to hearing your latest podcast too. That seems very exciting from what you've been telling me. Uh,
Yeah.
I was going to mention one or two other things at the outset. Oh, yeah. So the recording from last time and for this time, if everyone is comfortable with it, Dare and I were speaking about possibly proliferating it around the web, posting it on our social feeds if that's okay. If it's not okay, just let me know. I don't want to post anything more publicly without everyone's permission. So I'll be sending a note as well on Patreon about that. But if everyone's good with that, then we'll move forward with doing so. Um, so if there's nays, let me know. That's the most important thing. Okay, so here we are again. Hopefully more of us would have a chance to dive into the book and or the audio book and get more of the context and more of the yarning present. So maybe a little bit less so than last time. I just kind of want to open it up for everyone to share if there are at this point particular impressions or reflections that have been weighing on us or eager to jump forth into this circle of conversation. So um, I will just mention that the chapters on the school system and that whole process is obviously weighed very heavily for me in the context of what's going on in contemporary news with First Nation peoples in Canada, and obviously the vast history that is continuing to be literally unearthed and unveiled, even in the United States. And so to have a book that's just such a wonderful and personable and thoughtful and also philosophical, Tyson is trained in that way as well, to have all of that in this context, right? Of what happens and what has happened, what continues to happen, just really, I don't know, it just presents this um, intensity of a picture of indigenous thinking and being in the world, and what we're really not necessarily up against, but the context in which we are attempting to act ethically, right? In terms of, well, what do we do from here? How do we receive this knowledge and this sharing in an ethical way? And then secondly is like, okay, and knowing that, how do we embody this? So this is the awkwardness of it, the tension of it, right? This is also the thing that I've been bringing up in the meta modern circles and integral circles, this meta modern tension of oscillation between different worldviews. It's more than that. It's this sort of this kind of stumbling into um, uh, attempting to become or to learn how to become more place-based in our thinking, uh, to connect with this animistic worldview, or like Jeremy Lent, you're just talking, he calls it this animistic consciousness or animate consciousness. That might be more of an abstracted layer to talk about this, but becoming this, realizing this, recognizing this with the vast histories and the ghosts and the legacies. Like it's a lot to hold. So this book is really powerful, and I don't have any syntheses quite yet, but I'm just sort of holding. It's like kind of getting really inspired on the one hand and also getting a punch in the gut with like in the heart, and it's just like, here we are. I think we talked about that last time too with Tyson. He's like, can give you a punch in the gut. So that's my little share. And I have more thoughts, but I would really like to hear from more of us. So maybe Dare, jump to you. And then I wanted to go to Karen after that because Karen had a question.
Yeah, of course. I mean, let's just give a deep exhale together, I think. I've been really digesting this latest round of Tyson downloads. I've listened to two interviews with Tyson, so about 4 extra hours of sort of like new Tysonisms, and sort of I think it gives me more of an alive perspective of the book, because the book is embedded in this kind of giant network of their life and also their trauma. And I'm resonating in all these ways, and there's no easy. I think if I were to sort of put on a clown hat, which I really want to do more often, which is just like, there's no easy way to die, but it's going to happen anyway. And so easy isn't on the menu. So you got to pick something else. You got to pick interesting or weird or togethered, or, you got to pick something else on the menu. That, dying is natural, but it's an initiatory process, and those processes can't be sort of packaged and capitalized, even though people are trying to do that. We're trying to sort of go get your initiation trademark over here, pay me some money. It doesn't really work that way. And I think Tyson is trying to wake us up to a kind of hello again from all of our ancestors and descendants, to be like, empire doesn't last. So what are you going to do? Like, like, what are you going to do? And giving us some ideas, but also none of this is salvational, I don't think. And I think if we enter into animism with an idea that it's going to save us, we're going to replicate the Western colonial project again.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good caveat and a trap to be aware of, right? Because this is the awkwardness. This is that unbearable tension of becoming something other than this culture that we've been proliferating for a few thousand years. It's the exits are traps because we're bringing so much with us that we're actually reassembling the same worldview in very sneaky ways, very sublimated and sneaky ways, right? And that's sort of the something that Gebser talks about as well with the structural, the mutational views. In the interim period, in that tension between, you're going to be there's a vertiginous quality, and that you don't really like, am I moving away from that, or am I actually going back into it in a new way? Like, is there this integral consciousness that's really consolidating here, or am I actually carrying along with me in my little carrier bag a lot of sneaky framings that are going to end up replicating that mental structure, or that
Well,
efficient structure?
and it's also not an either or good bad dynamic, because if we look at the microbial world that we actually are mothered by, like they're not some others, they're us, they're our mother, like the microbial fungal world. It's like infections are just like jockeying for attention in the bio meat space, right? It's like everything is infected. Everything is not just infected, but it's also infectious. But that doesn't have to mean like, oh, dread or despair, but like, yeah, we are carrying things. Let's be aware as much as we can, knowing that we'll never be aware fully of what we're carrying, and also vice versa. When we enter a new space, we become infected by that space, but it's not morbid. And I just think that like the lightheartedness is kind of like waking up to like what Gebser is saying, the revelation that this has already been going on. Our deep time ancestors already had a consciousness that could perceive us in our myopia. And they didn't necessarily do anything about it because there's nothing really to do about it, right? It's like, oh, there's the kids are going to come along and they're going to be in the air, giant metal birds, and it's going to be weird. Things are going to explode a lot. So there's a sense that like it's always already. And yes, sometimes we transgress and then our immune system fails and then it's painful. And it's like on some level that pain is not a problem, but on a kind of personal, individualistic human level, we kind of want to mitigate it if we can, right? But also like in this larger scheme of things, yeah, my idea of disease is not really, God's
Yeah.
not really listening to that, like,
And into the kind of symbiotic view that Haraway talks about, and Margulis was such a fantastic, brilliant scientist, just really articulating it so well. Is yeah, things eat each other and get carried along and don't go away sometimes. So, like the symbiogenic view, like maybe this mental rational thing is gonna just be an organelle that this integral consciousness is going to coexist with, right? Like that's the ontology that I think is present in Tyson's work, which is everything's with each other. So it's
right.
like you're saying, it's going to be messy. There's going to be
And
viruses and
everything has dreaming, but it's like where in the network of distribution and redistribution does this dreaming sort of interrelate? Because as we can see from a from a non-allopathic lens, PTSD could turn into post-traumatic growth, which then treats the trauma as a kind of medicine, which then we don't want to eradicate. So it's like it's a very strange world in which like traumas are only traumas until they're initiations, and it's like, well, okay, what are we talking about even? It's like it breaks down English, right? It
yes,
makes English have to become poetic in order to deal with this kind of cyclical, organellistic, mutational combine. And then we end up being like, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's right. I don't know what my next action should be. I guess I should listen and relate in order to try to move together because there's no way for a consciousness to sort of really know in the way that Westernism says that knowing exists.
yes,
That
yes,
knowing is actually an interrelating and a kind of dancing. It's like, do you know where to step? I don't know. Let's listen to the music. The gravity's going this way. There's a way to dance, but dancing requires another way of listening and sensing that isn't like necessarily so predictable and words just keep falling apart, right?
yes, exactly, exactly. And again, like this is so in the I can't help but bring up the context. I just had that chat with Jeremy Lent, and one of the things Jeremy brings up is I was asking him like, okay, well, what is your take on this regenerative, integrative worldview? And I was bringing up our conversations here with in the context of Santok and Yonka Porta, and Jeremy brought up this sense of well, three principles, but they're really kind of interrelated. Like one is this sort of symbiotic view of the cosmos. Two is this sort of practicing an intentional purposelessness, just like being present with that context. And then if there's anything to do in that context is the third that he brought up, which is act out of that knowing, being, relating. Like, and there's no like roadmap necessarily that way. It's like the best thing you can do is to not make a decontextualized roadmap out and really just, as you're saying, become present, navigate, listen, and respond out of that ethical kinship with the human and the non-human, or more than human, and see where we go from there. What does that look like at a civilizational level? But the onus is still like, okay, but let's start trying to be and live this way. At the very least, we know that's what we need to be or can be doing presently. Um,
There's a trap of there's a trap of scalability that we want to jump to. We want to end game because we want to save something that we think needs saving, which is usually us and our idea of who we are and all the other things. And of course, we don't want the children to die, but yet they're still dying. So what are we really doing, you know? But yes, it's like the smaller is always going to lead to the larger. So don't try to start with the larger because it's almost it's almost like completely non-functional. It's like the only thing that I can do is be a body where I actually am, and my consciousness constantly refers back to that body. So even if I dissociate and think that I'm somewhere else, it's not true. It comes back. It refracts back. It bounces back. So I'm here all the time, and you're there, and we can chat, but it's still a here and a there on a sense, on the scale that we're at. The scale that humans are at is like if someone was bleeding next to you, you should probably get a towel and like staunch the wound, right? Like there's just a kind of immediacy to environments and bodies, right?
yes, exactly. Uh, I'm aware of us doing.
Yeah,
Dare, you and I are doing a
we
yarn.
gotta. Yeah, no,
So let's
we gotta go to other people for
yeah
sure.
yeah. Let's jump to Karen and uh, Betty, and then Veronica, if that's okay. And then everyone who wants to jump in, just either raise your hand or mention it in the chat, and I'll try to catch you there. Yeah.
Wow, well, I love the metaphor of the dance. Of course, I think immediately of the divine Leela. All of manifestation is the divine dancing in this moment. And so, yes, the dance. So what I would love to do, if I ever get a chance, is invite or challenge Tyson Yunkaporta to a dance off. I'll dance how I see things, and he'll dance and we'll dance together, and we'll challenge and we'll adapt. And because I was thinking actually of that knife fight that he mentions early on. I've had a chance to read this in a lot more detail than I did last time. I'm still not through it, but early on he mentions that in the indigenous societies, the knife fight with stone knives, where there are very specific boundaries. You can cut your opponent on the arms, the legs, and the back if you can, and that's harder. But when the fight's over, whoever cut the other one more technically wins, but then they have to be cut in exactly the same place as they cut the other. I love that metaphor. And so I was actually thinking, hey, wouldn't it be fun to challenge Tyson to a stone knife fight? I actually, back in my macho martial arts days, I actually did a little bit of knife fight training, not much, but as long as it's limited to arms and legs and whatever. But I love that too as a metaphor. Really, it's a metaphor for we're challenging each other, and maybe something he says will mean I need to reassess how I see the world. This is a good thing. And maybe something I say will challenge you or somebody else. I mean, as we open ourselves to being challenged like this, the problem is when we accept interactions is that what we are really risking, and this already came up, is we are risking, if I am, to the degree I am identified with what I think, how I see the world, and my sense of myself now, it's like dying to let that go. That's the ego death. And that's the ego death that as you try to open to higher inspiration, the kind of intuitions you were talking about, the trans-rational, we have to let go of what we held as ourself or how we see the world. And that's an ego death. And you have to be willing to die, right? To enter these exchanges, you have to be willing to let go. So with that, I want to say, I would like to call bullshit on page 117. Here we go. On Tyson's whole story about Prussia, the historical antecedents of the Prussian education system. I think what he said about the education system from Bismarck on, the 1870s and so on, I mean, there's a lot of heft to that. I certainly felt like I was in prison the entire time I was in public school. Before that, it's bullshit. I'm speaking as a historian. I mean, he took a lot of pieces and threw them together, and he even admits going in, let's see, where did he say it? It's a couple pages before. He starts, there are cracks in the stories I'm sharing here too, the grand narratives and the cheeky counter narratives I am presenting to disrupt them. I mean, he's being provocative, and that's what he does. He lures us in with this, oh, it's we too, this very personable, and then he provokes, and sometimes he punches. And so, okay, that's his game. Okay, I'll dance with stone knives. Sure, okay. And then he talks about shortly after that, he's admitted that this is a cheeky counter narrative, and then a paragraph later he talks about people who says they all engaged with my story about Prussia, though, which surprised me because it's probably the most lunatic incendiary rant that has ever fallen from my lips. So he himself has admitted that, and you know, I'm gonna spare you. I mean, I could go through his whole thing about ancient Prussia. It's bullshit. He threw that together to be provocative, and he admitted it himself. That said, he brings up what he brings up behind the cover, jab, 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 you know, to get the opponent rattled, right? Behind that are some deeply serious issues that challenge me where I live as a historian, as somebody who sees history from the Big Bang on in stages, emergent orders of ever greater complexity. This is a challenge to us to decolonize the serious problem behind this, where he says a few pages earlier, the narrative of progress is grounded in the myth of primitivism, the widely held assumption that life before the industrial era was brief, brutish, savage, and simple. And that at the core, this is what we need to decolonize in all of our own history and culture. I would love to pitch into that as a cultural historian, this deeply ingrained, taken for granted mindset that's so big we've never seen it until we're starting to question now. Oh yes, the childhood of humanity, you know, the ancient hunter-gatherers, the childhood of humanity, and then we end up with things like those boarding schools for kidnapped Indigenous children in Canada, the United States, and Australia. And you know, that one hits me where I live too. I mean, and in fact, those my presentation I did at San Diego Integral a couple of months ago ended up being around that. Is how do we reimagine and understand our understanding of Gebser's stages without falling into the trap of saying, oh yes, the hunter-gatherers, childhood of humanity. I cannot imagine anything more horrible than to be a parent of a child, a 7-year-old, say, have that child kidnapped, taken away, but my child is going to be raised by people who don't love him. I have no idea what kind of bondage, what kind of brutalities. Now, this is not limited to Indigenous peoples. This has happened throughout human history. I mean, the African Americans whose children were sold into slavery, the ancient Hebrews in the Lamentations of Jeremiah, after they'd been basically kidnapped and relocated to Babylonia. It's in the Lamentations of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. Before their eyes, their little ones are led away into captivity. Weeping, they weep in the night. Plorons ploravit in noctem. I mean, this has been one of the horrors that have been perpetrated throughout the history of humanity as far as we have history. It's not unique to Indigenous peoples, but it certainly has been a major trauma for them. And I certainly applaud what Tyson Yunkaporta is doing, challenging all of us to face this. And I'm willing to dance. So anyway, so even though calling bullshit on that whole 9,000 years of Prussians, no. But the deep issues, absolutely. So I'll wind up there.
Well, that was great, Karen. Thank you. I applaud also your volunteering to participate in this decolonizing of the stages. I think this is probably the most important thing the integral community specifically has to be doing right now if it has an ethical ground to stand on, period. Like, that's really where I'm coming down. And honestly, in the context of the conversation happening outside of our circle around stages of development, and Nora Bateson's provocation, which is also a kind of trickstery provocation, that ended up being very clearly in my conversation with Nora and what we're going to be publishing, where she's drawing the line. Like, are these models too dangerous to be wielded by anyone? Because it seems like this is where we always end up. right? We always end up with this, the boarding school. We always end up with this process of colonization. So even the models that are trying to rework them and to handle them lightly or to handle their history and go forward, she's not sure, because she sees the communities left and right just throwing these labels at each other. And it's like, okay, well, maybe what if we walk away? That's her provocation. What if we walk away? Can we still do good? Can we still do this transformation that needs to occur? So very good question. And also, I like that you're calling bullshit on Tyson's admittedly, as he says, kind of lunatic approach to trickstery approach to this narrative. But yeah, how do we overcome that? How do we circumvent or deconstruct and then provide another avenue to talk about growth and evolution and emergence, et cetera? Because anybody who sees life on Earth sees this happen, period. I mean, evolutionary perspectives on symbiogenesis, et cetera. So I don't think there's necessarily, I'm going to shut up in a second. I don't think there's necessarily too much of a need to reconstruct the wheel. I think a lot of contemporary science has a theory of change, just in terms of like the Margulis Haraway approach to symbiosis, to me anyway, is enough of a theory of change to work with that readily accepts that there's emergence and evolution, but it doesn't do it in such a linear way. And the metaphors and the maps that we get from using that science, that aperspectival science, are much less, they stink much less of this residue of colonization and stages. And those go back before science. Those go back to even the word barbarian is this kind of pejorative that I believe the Greeks used for particular groups, just to literally utter bar was a kind of like, they don't even know how to speak, those people who don't live in cities. So it goes back. It's one of these fundamental meta narratives of states and agricultural societies and differentiating themselves from different ways of being in the world. So yeah, how do we do this? How do we do this right, with the good history and the good anthropology and the good ethics? And can we still play with meta narratives after that? I think we can. But anyway, yes to this as a further conversation too. Let me go to, who did we, I always forget after a while. I think it was
Betty.
Betty. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, Betty, you are muted. There we go.
I think I'm going to say some of the same thing you're saying it, but in a different way. I realized, like, we're all indignant. I can't even pronounce the word. We all came from the same place. Once you get sort of, and he has a definition like the culture being like the place. Well, the place that he stayed in is different than the place I'm in. I had a grandmother who knew how to plant a garden, and her daughter and her husband got a farm during World War II. They thought the Germans were coming over and they wanted a place to have food, but they didn't know how to farm. But my grandmother was able to get a hold of the pigs, got loosed, and get them back in the pen. So, like, and of course, the daughter and my uncle, my uncle and aunt were much more educated than my grandmother. But it's like we're so used to categorizing people by the education they have. And I wondered if Einstein knew how to grow plants or anything. But I certainly wouldn't want him to have lived a different life than he did live. But So the book was wonderful. It was translating, but to me it was like it was translating his language and images into. He even printed some of his language in the book, but he was translating it into a way I could understand what he was talking about. And he had wonderful stories, and the stories about how they handled sex with the young people was out of this world, really. But you know, it made you think. In different situations, people find different ways to solve their problems. They didn't want the young ones, to be having children too soon. So, but the ethics of it all would be entirely different of how we would handle it. And almost like looking at it, you know, we have so many preconceived ways. We think if we get smart enough, we'll be able to solve all the things in the world, you know, which is ridiculous. And one thing that keeps coming, like James Scott, you recommended that book, Against the Grain, and it shows even the way we think they developed, that people didn't go to the agriculture in the same way that we've always thought it did, you know. It shows the way it's developed is very personal for people in different places, and some people like now, people would like to have a place to go in the summertime, go to the beach and, you know, get oysters and cook them and then go back to another section of the country where the weather's better for them during the other part of the year. But so everything in it just kept upsetting the things that we sort of have compartmentalized and think this is the way people should live. These are the rules. This is good. These people aren't good because they didn't get this right degrees or something like that. And the other thing that hit me was loyalty. And even now, I think it's something we've missed track of. You know, my history, they're Roman Catholics, so they always, no Irish need apply and all that kind of stuff. The Polish during World War II, they defended their church, but as soon as the Russians got out of there, they changed. So it's something that we get loyal to some one thing and defend it. Instead of solving what other things are going on in the world that need to be sort of looked at. It was opening up to me that, well, maybe that a lot of this is more complicated than you're not going to be able to write one little, we're not going to be able to get it down to even one book on how we should go on with this world, because it'll be different for different people in different places. We see that what's happening in Afghanistan with all the different cultures and loyalties and killing each other off. But I think the basic thing was at the very beginning stages, they knew there was a life this life, the spirit within each person. And they recognized it in nature much more than we do, and in everything. And I think that's the basic thing we come from. But once you get going from there, it's just our little brains creating all these stories that we think are going to solve it all. And what we got to do is try to learn how to be with each other somehow. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. But I'm really like, he really is translating and getting all that information together about the stories and the different people and how they handle things is really nice.
Yeah. Thank you, Betty. I do see that. I do see Tyson's role as very much a translator, a mediator, and perhaps because of their own origins and feeling kind of in between different cultures in that sort of trans contextual space. It's made Tyson quite a profound translator and storyteller and yarner, and it's been just a wealth of learning for me as well. And as you're speaking, there is the sense that I was just thinking of the way the book ends, right? Tyson says, "My hope is that one day everybody can find a place under the law of the land where they live, transitioning our living systems into something that is sustainable in the true sense of the word. Old man Juma calls it the 7 families coming home and uniting again. We'd like everybody to look up to the stars and see the same stories there once more, and stop asking the question, are we alone? Of course we're not. Everything in the universe is alive and full of knowledge. Now that the small questions of existence have been answered, why are we here? How should we live? What will happen when we die?" I love how Tyson kind of inverted that. Like, those are just the small, the little questions, right? Like those are where we start, actually. Us too should be able to get back to the business of asking some of the bigger questions. We'll need living lands and bodies to do that, though. So let's put these hands of ours to work. And just bring that up because in many ways it's as complicated as this is, as much as this sort of is a Rube's gold brick complicated machine of civilization that we've built, I think a lot of the directions, the centers of gravity, the centerings, the pulling down, the growing down are really clear, and they're really difficult. Like, okay, how do we put our hands to work? How do we grow down into place? How do we learn how to pay attention to the stars? There's this like process, I think, that is regenerative and remedial, and that as much is clear to me in terms of like, what do you do after this book? What do you do with this sort of regenerative turn? And like Dare was saying earlier too, just about like, that's really all you can do in that sense is be in that flow of process and place and context and work from there, and try to cohere that and intensify that mode of being in the world again, in yourself and in your relationality. It's like almost, it almost sounds too easy, too simple, but it's not easy or simple at all. It's like the most weird, awkward, difficult, negotiating kind of thing that we could possibly do as human beings. Any kind of solution, any kind of strategy, any kind of like 10-point path to a planetary civilization would be easier than this. So just holding that tension. And thank you for sharing that, Betty. Let me jump to Veronica and then Tom, and anyone else, if you do want to jump on, just if you raise your hand, it's a little easier for me to queue us all up. But yeah.
Hello, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because I have construction noise around me. Yeah, I wanted to share a couple of things with you. I'm participating to this David Bohm webinar over 3 weekends. You know, David Bohm was a physicist who worked with Krishnamurti on a concept of dialogue. And the second part of the seminar is on indigenous life and change of consciousness. And there were 104 participants, I think, and it's one of those rare times, maybe the only time, where there were high-ranking, high-level scholars and scientists crying on Zoom, because we used the format of the dialogue, actually. And it means that we got into so many of the subtleties of the mental work that we were all doing, that including one of the speakers and organizers, and he's the director of the Krishnamurti School in Brockwood, England, had to pause and stop and just barely said, well, why am I saying this? Why? Where did that come from? That's my ego. And it went on and on this way. So on a lighter note, what I wanted to, first of all, to say that's important, in two instances and for several minutes, the works of Jean Gebser were mentioned. And you know, trying to explain and use them and so on. So that was very nice. And then we talked about one aspect, which I think is very much to what Derry was started with, the difference between intention and goal. And the fact that we're never conscious that everything, particularly when it's extreme, when it's crucial, when it's hurting us emotionally, we still make it a goal to change it. And if only we could remain with the intention within us to understand, or to not conceptualize, but to feel, to embody the problem, there wouldn't be any goal, but there might very well be a change at a much deeper level. I thought that was a very important thing. Something else was that was mentioned, and that was towards the very end of the webinar. What is the space, and I'm quoting, what is the space that sweeps all clean? And what if we could all meet in that space? That's very profound, and it's at this point not very practical. It's early philosophical or spiritual, but it's something to keep in one's, not mind, but body, I think. I think it's something so important. Visualize a space that sweeps all clean. It's almost poetical. And lastly, I just wanted to share something that I decided to practice for myself, and it has to do with Gebser and the perspectival, which I'm trying to understand. Well, I shouldn't say that. I should say I'm struggling with it. But one of the presenters gave an example of language. You know, we're talking about the issue of language. That every time we say, I understand, which we do, you know, commonly, especially if we want to show empathy with what somebody is saying or whatever, what is happening, say, oh, yeah, I understand. That's the problem. That's utterly perspectival, because it means we understand from a point of view in a world we already have. And it's the very opposite of what we probably want to do when we say, I understand. It means I want to be with you. You know, I care about what you say. I hear it. It's in my heart. But if we say, I understand, we convey the opposite message almost. So I decided to practice, because I find myself saying, I understand quite a bit. That's all.
Thank you, Veronica. I will pause my own thoughts for now to segue to Tom, who said that something you wanted to say, Tom, leads right into what Veronica, or is connected to what Veronica was saying. So if you want to jump in, Tom.
So I'll start there with that connection. And this is going back to Karen's comments too about boarding school, is that we do not understand what they went through. We do not understand the multi-generational ongoing impacts of that. We do not stand, we don't know what it feels like. And we cannot say that. That's kind of the worst thing to hear, I think, from anyone is, oh, I understand. Oh, that's so horrible. That's not what we do. That's not what we need to do. We need to listen. We need to listen. And I think that happens all the time. However well-intentioned, it is the wrong thing to do. And that's certainly the sense I've gotten from Native American friends listening to Native America Calling, especially about that issue, which of course came up again quite a bit recently. There's a great, Buffy St. Mariana, her most recent CD has My People, 'Tis of My People, You're Dying, a newer version based on Canada rather than the United States. It's really hard to listen to, but I recommend everyone does. And that comes up, of course, in that. At the same time, and this may go along partly with Tyson saying, you need to go back to your own Indigenous roots, stop asking us. When I was working on my master's in counseling was the same time Braveheart came out, and I was learning about my Scottish heritage and Scottish history. And I may have shared this here before, I have in some other groups, Jeremy, of yours, but one of the places I went to talk about doing practicum was First Nations Clinic, which was Native American run, and at that time specifically for Native Americans. And my experience, and I had friends at that point who were Native American counselors. Ed Duran, the author of Native American Post-Colonial Psychology, highly, highly recommend that book. Still very relevant 30 years after he wrote it. And Wilbur Wittes, who was a Dene, had developed a healing system around corn. So I went in to talk to the woman who was director at that time, and she basically said, why are you even thinking of applying here, white boy? And when I told that to those other two friends, they said, well, and started saying all the reasons why. But at this period, as I had really gotten into reading a lot about Scottish Highland culture and the genocide which the English perpetrated on the Highland people, especially from 1745 on, you know, I realized that was, having read Ed Duran's book about the impact generation after generation after generation of genocide, that that was only 3 generations from me in my family, just through the McDougalls. And another person at the time was a friend who was getting his PhD in Scottish Highland culture. And he talked about, which you just don't read about, that 1/3 to 1/2 of all Scottish males after Culloden were either executed, exiled, or imprisoned. And they didn't have enough prisons, so they just manacled them in the holds of ships anchored off the coast. And you don't read about that, and you don't hear about that in history books. And that's only a little bit of it. So at the time, and it's only been reinforced, I think it's probably safe to say that pretty much every group of humans have been both victims and perpetrators of genocide throughout history. I don't know if there are exceptions to that or not. So I didn't go back to talk to her, but I would have said all these things or come in with my friends and said all these things. So I like that it's coming up that, you know, it's maybe all we can do is sit with it and listen sometimes. You know, and again, I think the worst thing to do would be to, oh yeah, I know that because my Scottish ancestors went through it just. that also is just not the right thing. And even often it's well-intentioned, but it's not what's needed. I skimmed that whole chapter again, and I don't think it's parody at all. It's not totally inclusive, obviously, but everything he says in there, I think is all true and demonstrably true. I just think it's very incomplete. And I don't think it was especially tongue-in-cheek at all.
Sorry, which chapter?
The one that I asked you about, the one you were referring to, Karen.
The chapter on the knights and that whole thing, and you're calling bullshit on the particular
advanced and fair
historical framing,
right? And I don't think it's inaccurate at all. It's just incomplete. So, and I guess the last thing I'll just put in a little plug, one of the only local, well, that's not true at all now. One of the local presenters at the Warm Integral Conference is Glenn Aparicio Perry, who's a friend, and I think you know him pretty well, Jeremy. And he's going to be one of the presenters. And he worked with David Boehm's group for 20 years, I think it met with physicists and native elders. And fortunately, it looks like more and more, especially since the only possible funding sources I know of are for Native American groups that Glenn has suggested, there's already a lot more Indigenous involvement. There's going to be 2 potters from Acoma talking about pottery. There is a brother and sister punk rock band that is amazing, that got to do about 4 songs before they were rained out at an outdoor venue last week. And they will be not only playing one of the nights, but they'll be doing a presentation also. So that's going to be a large element now, is Indigenous knowledge, along with regenerative work, and then the much more Gebserian integral and warm data. But these are, Sand Talks, I still keep saying to everyone, this is the most important book of the last 2 years. It just is kind of like Nora's little smoke bomb or flashbang. It's an incredible tool that's doing its job really, really well. Okay, I'll stop for now.
Agreed, Tom. About this book, I'll pause as well. I feel like I want to hear Dare chime in. So if you want to jump in, Dare.
Yeah, I mean, I have good news and bad news is the good, and they're the same news, right? It's like I have good news and bad news, but it's the same news, is that we're all related. And so we all come from the same lineage, technically. If you look at the big scale, right? It's like I can, in dream time, in ritual, in trance, in various technical methodologies, have real relational encounters with deep time ancestors that are personal, intimate, and that I probably shouldn't share the intimate details of, but I can sort of feel the ramifications on my life, right? And in the weaving of diversity, all of our stories are in some way fragmentary, and in some way stories are purposefully fragmentary or purposefully incomplete. And you could say, well, then everything's a fiction. Well, no, it's like truth, like you get to this place where truth and fiction are kind of dancing with each other all the time, because each of us will never really have the most completeness, like cognitively, like if we try to do a macro story, it sort of washes and flattens and erases all of this diversity. And if we try to do a diverse story, we recognize we're never going to be complete, we're never going to finish, and we're never going to get to the next neighbor and the next neighbor, because there's a kind of, it's so deep and vast to just even plumb the depths of 3 generations of your blood relatives, right? It's like, oh my goodness, right? And you could talk about 30 generations, you could talk about 3 generations, and you come to the same kind of beautiful problem, which isn't a problem. It's like that paradox of living. So I think where we get stuck is we want to sort of check a box in either direction. Oh, well, I've done all my ancestor work for the last 30 generations, and that's checked off the list. It's like, well, that's impossible. Oh, well, I've talked to the singularity unit called, the Holy Mother, that is at the center of time and is actually all of time, and it's the goddess energy, and so that's, I've checked that off the box. And I've done all those things, or I've experienced, or I've been gifted with those experiences in all directions. And I can go right now, I can say that, like, I'm not done. I've glimpsed a thing, I've tasted a flavor, I've been gifted with a kind of relationship, and I'm not finished, and I'm still listening. And there's going to be another mutation and another story and another pain and another grief that needs tending, and I can't get to them all, right? And I think, I wouldn't have been able to even have this conversation 4 years ago, maybe not even 3 years ago, I don't know. And so we're dealing with a kind of human kinship pattern where a lot of people are at a place where they're just so full of unrecognized or unresolved or untended pain that it's like the ledger is all red. And so there is no, I don't even have an answer to any of this. It's just like those of us who have done maybe enough trauma healing work to even be able to stand up and be like, fuck, I can feel the grief, but I'm not like falling over. We're all on the same ship. So it's like, oh, are you on the left side of the Titanic or the right side? And I'm not trying to plunge us into a kind of hopelessness, but I'm also not trying to shoot us into this salvational thing where, like, oh, if we only listen to the stars, we'll be okay. Because it's like, I don't fucking know, if we're going to be okay. But I'm really interested in hearing where, like, reading Tyson's book and the spirits that are involved in them being able to even say, I got a thing I want to give the world, and I don't know how it's going to be received, but here it is. And I'm interested in sort of like these flashpoints where in the book, you, the reader, actually get visited by something that isn't Tyson. It's not Tyson trying to teach you something, but it's like Tyson says something and your own nervous system essentially ruptures and lets in some kind of awareness that was previously being obstructed for whatever myriad reasons, because that's just what nervous systems do. So that's really what I'd love to be able to sort of segue to. And of course, there's 2 more sessions, so it's like I'm sort of praying over time here. Not to sort of take Tyson's words even at face value, because I don't even know what face value means in this context, but to say, where in the yarning did you find yourself bleeding? And instead of trying to patch that up, actually go, well, what's happening?
Yeah. And I just want to reiterate, anybody who wants to jump on and share some of those bleeding onto the pages, definitely feel welcome to jump in and do a little bit of that sharing. I just wanted to mention, Dare, that I was listening to the audiobook, like my little micro shares. I was listening to the audiobook, doing some yard work with certain plants, and it was the part of the book about ghosts and being at this writer's retreat and then talking about ghosts. And then there was something Tyson said about the whole spooky story of falling unconscious, etc., and then basically saying, like, what I deal with for the most part are the ghosts of settlers everywhere, and like otherwise, like if you're like you'd have to like fall over and pass out drunk on like an indigenous special sacred ground or a burial space to really kind of get those ghosts to come bother you and cause some problems. So something about that, and in a completely way that I don't even know how to articulate, it confirmed certain encounters and experiences, and then even a felt sense of where I'm living here in the Pinellas County area, which used to be Seminole territory. Just the sense like, oh, that's what I've been feeling. That's what I feel like kind of passing through the alleyways. There's been this interesting, this might sound weird, but there's been this sort of interesting sense of things, beings that pass through. And I was just talking with my wife about it in the context of Chinese medicine and going into between dreaming and waking and having a kind of vulnerable state of catching ghosts. So all of that was just spinning and very present for me, and in a way where I kind of almost felt like pausing the audio book with Tyson. And Tyson in the book actually said something like, I'm gonna stop writing now and like really try to respect it. And I felt like total vulnerability to those ghosts and to my own ghost like nature, just in terms of like how much am I also like them. So yeah, that was my little moment recently. But let me go to Lee, and then Veronica.
So that's funny because that was what I was going to talk about too when you were saying, yeah, because it was not that it was a tear. It felt like it was when I heard it. A lot of the things in the book, were like running over scars that have been mended, but are still like super tender, and hearing it from an outside source, like a lot of the understandings being things that I've gathered myself, and then having it all in one place of being of like reiterating these senses that I have experienced too. Is just it was like a release and an activation at the same time in my gut. And when it reminded me of the things that I had to do to get to the point where I could hear those ghosts moving through without feeling like I was crazy. Because not of being raised, I was raised white, and so having no teacher to go to understand what I was experiencing, and just being labeled as crazy in the colonialized context was extremely disturbing. And to be, and then to heal myself through ancestral work of just doing it and listening and finding different ways that people were coming into my life to teach me, but as an adult, just hearing that in their context as well is like, oh, this is so important. And then what Dare just said of knowing, there's a deep knowing of continuity of knowledge, and that we keep on touching on it a little bit of westernized and colonialized academia, something that I've had a lot of resistance to, but was really drawn to like prove the things that I knew, but rejecting it again and again because I keep feeling it like creeping into my indigenous knowledge capacity to fix it. Like, oh, if I think about it in this way and I can prove it, then it will be legitimized, and even that feels wrong. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm just going to sit with it and listen more. And then I'm hearing more people come, like this book, of knowing that. And so I keep getting, it feels like the way that science has proven indigenous understandings. They keep proving it too. And I'm like, oh, see, yeah, it's all real. Everything that I was told. But so that is those like wounding in the book was more like, oh, that's so right. Yes, thank you. And then like more healing. And what Dare just touched on about when you know how to tend it in your cells, like in our cell, I really feel like at the end of the book for me was so powerful, where it was that basically what I felt like they walked us through is the conversations that I have with the ancestors that I know to be, and also the spirits that I know to be good, to tending to me, to be telling me, not the damaged ones that I know are generational. I'm a product of the colonized and the oppressed and the oppressor. Like so being discerning about this is the tone, the actual rhythm of conversation that I'm having, and I feel it in my body when it's right. And like, whew. And then being able to tend to myself in ways that a lot of Western culture is coming to understand, then I can tend to other people in that same way. And it's this micro to macro. And that's what I feel like the whole book was really trying to convey, that of like, look at all these ways where I was just so like ping-ponging around in my trauma. And then I had these processes and these understandings that I knew were true. And I stuck with those, and I stuck with them. I kept on going back and doing it over and over and over again. And that diligence, that like focus of a mindset that can hold the complexity, because that's something we talked about last time that I forgot to mention because I got really lost. But complexity, we've worshipped this very narrow view of what complexity is, and thinking that we're getting more complex when it's actually just a zoomed in view of certain complexities, but we're not seeing the connection of the complexities. And that is a consequence of the scientific method, that I feel like. And it's just it's one way of thinking about things, but we've elevated it to this worship of that way of thinking. And it's retrained all of us. So with untraining ourselves by, that's what I'm saying, is that process of listening, deep listening, because that's what we've lost in worship, I believe, looking at those complexities and the mind body disconnect and all of that. So anyway.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah, all of that. Yes, to all of that. Yes, that there is something that Gebser really articulates that so well with the kind of myopic innovation of perspectival thinking and the pyramidal cone that he articulates. There's this hyper complexity of what's in that little sliver, that little visual pyramid of measurement, right? You could really master depth perspective and like have the mathematics of the physics of the sort of Newtonian relations, but there's still this severing out of the context of the relational living world, right? That we've kind of given up. I mean, McLuhan talks about that too, like every kind of cultural move to this new mode or ecology, it almost in a sense dissociates or fragments our body. That, okay, if I'm going to emphasize the eye, then I'm really going to de-emphasize the gut. And that's not necessarily has to happen, but that's the way it happened with this perspectival scientific method, right? There's this sort of Cartesianism. So then we're kind of these pretending to be floating disembodied beings, measuring the world, creating civilization, and just sort of creating this like fantastical machine that seems to have run away from us, called industrial neoliberal capitalism, which is like, yeah, let's just see that visual pyramid. Like tomorrow up ahead is more money, less context, and shaping the world we want to have. And everything's just a resource for that, right? So it's that kind of severing that I think is, yeah, that's visceral. Like that's not, this is something that comes up in the Gebser classes too. Like the severing, when it clicks, you get that visceral sense of, oh my gosh, I've been doing this. So this is the whole context of this entire civilization. This is not just a theory or like a clever way of systematizing our contemporary world. This is like a way of embodying ourselves that's intrinsically like becoming a knife. It's becoming an eye that is a knife that severs things. And there's a lot you can learn from doing that, but that's a weapon. And so like, we're not going to get rid of the weapon, but we have to learn how to wield it, and have to learn, like, you know, that's not the only way to engage the world is with the agricultural scythe that like cuts time and cuts the living things down. There's other ways. So anyway, yeah. Wow, Lee, thank you.
Well, one thing I wanted to add to that is that one of the ways that I got into that thinking is when I was in early university and just taking economics classes about externalities, and like that's just a fact in that world. And I'm like, everything's connected, don't you know? And now it's become, I mean, those environmental externalities are what is causing so much suffering, and it has feedback loops that they didn't anticipate, that they could just push away, and that there's no way. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that was a really significant doorway into understanding that that's just a way that this system works, is thinking that there's no way. And the knife metaphor, I love that. Yeah.
There's an array of modes of engaging the world, and sometimes the knife is important, and then sometimes the fire is important, and there's sometimes, I don't know, planting things with your hands is important, or picking things off, or relocating bugs to other areas of the bioregion to help you grow it. Like there's so many ways of engaging. There's so many transcontextual, you know what I'm talking about. So let me shut up now and move to Veronica, and then Karen, and whoever else wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm going to belabor on this viscerality aspect, because if we're going to participate, it needs to be embodied. It means that we need to realize the importance to find, for each one of us needs to find the space that cleans, that washes away. And it is visceral, it is physical. An example of it, we just need to open our wounds before we clean them. And it's not about, you know, eating well and getting vaccinated. It's doing this awful surgery on ourselves. And I want to share an example of this. I have a very close friend whose father was a chronic depressive, and he made the decision to get suicide on the day of her 20th birthday. And he sent a letter to her saying he was going to do that. So it not only happened, but she knew it was going to happen. So if you fast forward 50 years or so, she spent her life, probably genetically, she also acquired, she had the depression. She went to each and every variety of clinical treatments and therapies you can imagine, until one day she decided to go to the grave of her father, which was very remote, in a huge cemetery in Paris, where you have hundreds and hundreds of graves next to each other. So you come to the cemetery and you ask, you know, for where you should go, and you get a map and you go. So she's on the grave, and she spent, you know, about an hour crying and going all over and talking, physically talking to her father in the tomb. That was her embodied opening of the wound. And when she was relieved and done and washed away, she had found that space. She proceeds to go out of the cemetery and she sees this staff, this employee waving at her, saying, Madame, 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 don't go away. I'm so sorry. I gave you the wrong grave. And you know what she said? She looked up and said, you know what, Dad, I've done it. I'm going to just say it again. I'm leaving. You know what I have to say. And that was it. From that day onwards, she was healed. No medication, no treatment, no nothing. And I think it's where each one of us is. I believe so. That's the work we have to do.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Veronica. The phrase you keep saying about that kind of clearing, there's a line from Gebser's poetry that comes to mind. He says, and thanks to this, and thank you, Dare, also for getting me into this habit of sharing Gebser's poetry now. And thanks to this, your heart, remelted in the coldness and radiance of running tears, lost the exquisitely numbing scent of syringa, and emerged into the gentle diaphaneity of things. It's difficult to arrive there, but how can we continue to arrive in this gentle diaphaneity of things? That's what's speaking to me, and when you share that turn of phrase. There's another line. I this is not from a poem, but if I could just quickly perhaps find it in this old slideshow I just cracked open here. Just a second. It's from a later text of Gebser's that I have been sharing right now. Let's see if I can find it here. No, well, I kind of know it, at least in as a paraphrase, but Gebser essentially says, you know, there's no, like, this is not about preparing something and anticipating some event to happen to us on the horizon, right, on that perspectival horizon. It's about going within and clearing the ground of our own bit, our innermost being, weeding the ground of our innermost being. So there's a resonance here just in those 2 points I wanted to share with you. Thank you. Let me jump to Karen and then Adam. And I know we're coming up at the 90-minute mark, and we could push over that or not. We'll see where we are after. Yeah, Karen.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to keep this short because I want to hear what Adam has to say. But I'm looking back at that post that Sam posted in the chat about 5-6 minutes ago. He quoted Morin, the rational mode unyoked, quote, mutilates the whole. And I said, yeah, I mean, this is what developing the intellect, which is what basically all of Gebser's stages are about, developing the rational intellect. And it dismembers, and this visceral sense, I mean, it dismembers us. It takes us into focusing, like Jeremy, you articulate so beautifully how Gebser defines that the perspectival view, where you can act with incredible, powerful precision on a very small piece. But the problem is you have isolated that piece from the rest of, creation. And you can act very powerfully and precisely. You can, wow, now we can invent calculus. We can build bridges that can hold, we can build skyscrapers, but we are so alienated from the world of our ancestors that we're dying inside. We feel so alienated once you reach modernity and post-modernity. It is the development of the rational intellect was a dismemberment. But now I'm going to look at a larger pattern because I like big patterns. I like looking at vast complexity and finding patterns. Like since the Big Bang, we have had a track record, according to our Western science, we have had a track record of systems, emergent systems of greater complexity. Starting with the Big Bang, you can go through the physiosphere and then the biosphere. Once you get to the biosphere, life, DNA, you have a long period, billions of years, when they're just small single cell, simple cells. But then the cells start getting complicated because they have organelles inside, things that were previously small individual simple cells joined together in a larger cell and become, they still exist as separate entities, but now they're organelles in a larger system. After another billion or so years of those cells start specializing and exchanging across their boundaries. And then we start, look, we've got plants and animals. We have a track record going back to the start of life on this planet of specialization and exchange, right? Now you go through the biosphere until you get Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago. This seems to be the consensus in my rudimentary reading of archaeology. And once you get Homo sapiens, you get tribes, special people and tribes specializing and exchanging with each other. This is the beginning of capitalism, folks. I mean, capital is basically stored energy. I see, now this is my definition, read Adam Smith. I'm coming from Adam Smith here. You can define capitalism any way you want to, Tom. This is how I'm defining it. But what I'm pointing out here is that we have a track record going through human society, and with Homo sapiens, we come up another level where we start specializing and exchanging among each other and among other tribes. And now we form societies, we form civilizations, yada, yada, yada. Now I'm going back to that quote by Sam, who posts that quote by Moore, the rational mode unyoked mutilates the whole. Absolutely. But then now that we've got all these dismembered pieces, we have Gebser's stages where we have taken the world apart and viewed it through certain very narrow perspectives. We are creating a larger container in which these specialized operational capacities become organelles in a larger, what you want to call it, integral, meta-modern, or whatever. We don't want to just throw them away. I don't see it. It's like, oh, it's a vast mistake. Here, I vehemently disagree with those good people who say agriculture was the worst mistake humanity ever made. I see, we can put this all together. The dismembering of the whole, it was at the cost of very great suffering. Would there have been any less suffering if we had all remained hunter-gatherers? I have no idea. But all of this can be contained in a vast, larger whole where we remain who we are. We also recognize that we always have been parts of something much greater, and we're starting to wake up to some of those as we go transrational, and some of these wonderful experiences people have been sharing, that there is life in all things, there is consciousness in all things. We've never been separate from it. We have been under the illusion that we were separate from it. And eventually we come out to the Buddha's radical insight that we have never existed as separate beings anyway. That we're growing toward that great insight. I think we can take all these pieces and integrate them into a larger whole that contains us and allows for even better well-being. So I echo the blessing at the end of Tyson's book. I wish that for all of us. And I want to hear what Adam has to say.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, what are we becoming? I think that's the big question. And how does this, you brought up really endosymbiogenesis from Margulis and the theorists that have followed from her. And that's the metaphor I've been taking for cultural evolution as of late as well. It's this sense of complementarity, that indigenous complexity is, well, more not is, let's go back to the modern, the mental, and just say, what if it's the modern mental structure is an organelle in a larger organism? There's that important move that I see Bio doing and Nora doing, and a lot of indigenous philosophers and thinkers doing in the present, which is decentering the modern without deconstructing or saying it was all some giant mistake. It's like, yeah, that was interesting what we did, and it brought out certain capacities. It, like, if we're using the metaphor of the knife, then it really brought out that capacity of the eye and the blade, and the eye is a severing. Awesome, cool. Lots of problems with that though. So, and we're more than that as well. So how do we hold all that? And how does that coalesce? What is the kind of really interesting mutational organism we are becoming right now amongst all that? Because it's it's neither one thing or another. It's speaking maybe to like Dare's techno-animism post, right? Like, how do we metabolize the techno-industrial world and shrink it down to an organelle in this organism that we're becoming? That's that's like what I'm so interested in, and to be continued. Adam, you're up.
Okay, I'll go super quick. This was fantastic. So I've been thinking a little bit about, in living systems, we rarely see one-way infiltration of complexity into a system that doesn't go back the other way. Overwhelmingly we see cross mixing, etc. And it's funny because we'll call it the Columbian Exchange, and then we'll talk about colonization, which is a one-way directional action and movement. But what's the word for everything that went the other way in an exchange? And, does it colonize back, right? Or is it simultaneously a two-way colonization? But I think there is a distinction here because it's not colonization, it's a different thing, right? But that doesn't mean it's not flooding back at an incredibly rapid rate and actually transforming everything that's happening, right? So the perspectival approach would be to say that, like, the Pilgrims landed and they built America and they wiped out and they created this new thing, and that nothing was floating back through the culture and hitting the streets of London, as soon as the first survivors, made it back or whatever, or along with the ideas, etc. That it's very easy to say that. I think that there's a space to open up and say that there's an assumption that voices are silenced there that may not have been. If you look at, so I love Florence Nightingale, right? I don't know if any of you have ever been to a nursing graduation, but they're really amazing. It's very schmaltzy and cheesy. It's hard not to cry. They will, most of the time, they might wear like something of a more traditional, like Florence Nightingale style stole or whatever, but they will often hold the lamps or candles, but usually it's something like the lamp that the first nurses, right, in this structure, held at night in the Balkans to keep the men from having to die alone, right? The soldiers who were dying. And they will, there's a procession and there's a ritual of making this. It goes beyond the Hippocratic Oath and it taps deeply into a dark divine feminine. There's a lot of imagery from both the Madonna. There's an esoteric thing that came through with Florence Nightingale, and you feel it. It's very Catholic when you're in the graduation ceremony. You can feel it, right? But she didn't invent this, it didn't go from Greece to Florence Nightingale, right? There's a deeper ground that stepped into the room there, right? So when she discovered something for Western civilization, a very radical approach to humanity, like she was going to treat she didn't care. We're not going to care. The Hippocratic Oath made allusion to this, but she really demonstrated care for both sides. It was a radical concept for the people that it impacted, but who of these other voices was in the room when that happened, right? Who was sitting around the fire 50,000 years ago, right? Being in that space across time and space with her, what all was coming through. So that keeps coming into my mind. So I've been playing with, I wrote down holonization, right, this morning. And I'm sure somebody has better language for it out there in a book I haven't read, but the movement of these holons, memes, ways of being, stepping away even from saying archetype here, because I think it's too restrictive. The way that these moved throughout every bit of space that was attempting to colonize, right, is something that we participate in silencing and ignoring and seeing as well, right? The ways that we have been transformed and are continuing to be transformed. And there are ways in which I think that we talk a lot about different types of wisdom and things like that being co-opted, being corrupted, being poisoned by modern capitalism, industrialization, et cetera. And that is like 1,000% true and valid concerns. And you can look and you can see right where it's going to happen, where it's going down, et cetera, right? Modern corporate, corporatization of these ancient roles, et cetera, right? Simultaneously, does the healer like come through whether you want it to or not, so is these things that we attempt to shut out, are they still present in the room with every nurse's touch, right? Right now, there are lots of people who would benefit from ancient plant medicine, rituals, the guided journeys, et cetera. And there's a lot of people who the only way they would be able to go on this ancient ritual is for it to be like in a strip mall, to look exactly like a doctor's office, for the name of the substance to be like a Latin and Greek, very corporate, big pharma sounding word, and people in white coats, and it very explain for the divine to be scrubbed a bit, right? But the divine's still in the room. Like you can't get it out, right? It's there in the healing. Every time the healing happens, all of that other is still present, So I think that these are just random things I'm saying, guys, here that are just keep coming up for me. The last one I'll say that's random that comes up for me is about the things going on with stage theory and with developmentalism, et cetera, which is that I think it's humorous because developmentalism plotted out this, predictive arc of what you can see what's going to happen as a thing becomes, develops further, right? Whether it's a field of study or humanity or consciousness or whatever. But developmentalism itself, then if you look at what should happen to developmentalism itself, it should be on cue for the complete involution, the complete revolution, the complete implosion, where it all falls apart into disparate pieces and reorganizes into something else, where a second tier developmentalism emerges. We're on target for the blasting of a new perspective that would make all prior developmentalism look like ignorant, hateful child's play, right? And so it's like, if you're going to sign up for that project, like it's going to happen to you. And I really feel like in this process, there's no one who's going to get through the great global calamity we're in, but also this kind of the things that are happening in our world, where those people who have to go on TV and apologize because their racist posts got put out on the internet and they realized they were like the problem, right? I think a lot about the feminists in the 50s and 60s who were freedom riders. They were going to DC to protest, and they talk about how they were all going to fight for civil rights, for liberation, for all of these things, and they would all be geared up about radically like restructuring the world. And then the women would make the sandwiches and the guys would sit in the front of the bus and they would sit in the back, and they'd all ride to the deal together. And it wasn't until like the late 60s and 70s that they started realizing what was going on. And I think if you ask their kids in the 90s and the 2000s, you'd hear the other things that were still not even seen, right? So we're all those feminists. We're all in that place where it's like, are we looking to have our own, our own colonizer exposed and pulled apart and have it dissembled? And are we going to stay with that? Are we going to stick with that? Show me how I'm the bad guy. Show me where I'm participatory. Because even our solutions, even our like proper perspective is corrupted. We've never seen an instance of an uncorrupted, like holy approach to the entire thing, other than beginning with our own corruption. So yeah, that part right there definitely is sticking with me. So love you all. This is so fun and challenging, and you know, yeah, that's it. All right, I love you guys.
Awesome, Adam. Right back at you. Thank you for bringing that fire right at the end. I want to just mention a few things, like a few points that are a bit scattered. And I also want to invite Lee. I think Lee, your hand was raised too. So if you wanted to circle back as we wrap up, that would also be fine. But Nahuatl, the one of the indigenous languages of now modern day Mexico, there's thousands of words that have become part of Mexican Spanish. So just to that point about the colonizer colonized, the mingling and the enmeshment and the entanglement that starts to happen, and even in the express, like the physical, like being mestizo, right? Like you literally are just, okay, one side of your genetics and ancestry is, it came here and destroyed a way of life and multiple civilizations and cultures. The other was the one that was destroyed, right? And lived on outside of that context in the post-apocalyptic conditions. And then, you know, here we are speaking English and they're speaking Spanish, but Nahuatl is still very much a part of how that's been shaped. So yeah, I mean, that's always the kind of messiness of these histories. But to your last point, yes, like I'm just clapping. I don't know, like I'm just like cheering you on, just in terms of like, what is the work then? It's to I was thinking of like what Gandhi said about like civilization. He was like, oh, Western civilization is a good idea. It's like, well, stages of cultural evolution is a great idea, but like it hasn't really happened yet. In a way that's reflective of the reality that the stages are pointing to. And as you're saying, they're talking about like, oh, it gets nonlinear when we get to second tier, and they're fractal and they're holonic and they're interdependent. And it's like, okay, well, why don't we make the theory start looking like that from the get-go? And then we could start talking about its relevance for the world. So that's where I'm at right now with these things. And that's partly why I am writing the book that I'm working on right now. Nowhere near, like I do not have the theory that does that, but the work is in that book. And it's an invitation for others as well to start doing that work. So awesome. Lee, did you want to jump in at all? Was any thoughts? Like I said before, I saw your hand raised.
I had my hand raised. I don't know if you can hear me now because I'm having to drive.
Yeah, you sound a little further away.
So what was just said was really hitting on what I was thinking, like doing the work that we all have colonization inside of us and oppression inside of us. It's something that we've had to learn, even if our culture was a victim of genocide. Like my own ancestors had to learn how to survive within the system that they were in. And so doing that, the small internal work and the wounding, super important. And knowing when to like engage with it and when to nurture yourself. And it's a constant learning process that we're all going through. And feeling like you're held with, but I forget who said it, but about talking about the void and that clearing of like being able to hold ourselves and each other in this really intense path of accountability and responsibility is the key, I think, to moving everything into a more expansive understanding, and not, it's very personal and it's impersonal at the same time. Like, so that's just what I want
Thank you, Lee. Perfect note to end on. And I hope everybody heard that. So a little bit, yeah, holding the personal and the impersonal, and just this difficult work of clearing that space. That's that space that Veronica was speaking of. That's the clearing of the weeding of their innermost being, and holding ourselves and holding each other in this container is profoundly important and difficult, understandably so. Yeah, Dare, any
Yeah.
concluding
I
thoughts?
mean, in some ways we're still in training wheels, which, we have to kind of accept that we're still in training wheels, and that if other people, sneer at that, it's just part of the process of, like, being part of the whole family of beings. But I guess I just wanted to sort of say that, like, we have to deal with the ghosts inside us, inside our families, not just the ghosts that we don't like, because there are ones that we go, oh yeah, I don't want to be like Uncle Joe or Grandpa whoever. There's the obvious ghosts that we don't like. But I think what's even more insidious is the ghosts that we do like, and we like them to the point that we call them a personality. And we go, oh yeah, but that's not a ghost. It's like, well, have you taken a real hard look at like your urgency, or your need to strive, or your need to be powerful, or your need to be loved? Are you absolutely sure that that thing that you think is good inside you isn't just another part of the same ghost complex that is dying to be remembered, and then that remembrance is a kind of, it's a dissolution. It's not a staying with you. You don't get to keep it, you know? You don't get to hold on to it like, this is my power. This is my X-Men power. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe it's just passing through. So that's the thing I'd like to end on, is like, yeah, let's all deal with the ghosts that we don't like and the ghosts that we do like.
Perfect. Thank you, Dare. And thank you all. It's been great. And thanks for staying a little bit longer. We had to cut the last one short. So it's been nice to have some breathing room to explore together, and another wonderful session. Thank you all. And join Dare and myself, everybody, next month over at Animist Arts. I will be posting that info, and Dare has shared it in the chat as well. So let's continue the conversation. And for those who are participating, tomorrow there's the regular Integral Salon office hours. So if you didn't have enough, join me tomorrow, and join us tomorrow for some more. So, all right, everybody, have a good one. Talk soon. Bye.